the last couple of decades, it was logging companies from Malaysia. There were Taiwanese companies. The big thing in recent times is China, and the fact that the Chinese government is doing things like paying for the development of a huge new sports stadium where the Pacific Games are going to be held in 2 years' time, the Pacific Games being the regional equivalent of the Olympics. It's a big deal. But local businesses are frustrated in the Solomons because they see Chinese government money paying for the stadium, but also Chinese companies getting the contracts, Chinese labourers getting the jobs, and it's sort of occurring like it's on a separate planet, and they're not seeing any economic benefits. So that's one example that's often raised. Another one that's really a very big, less discussed example is the fact that the biggest gold mine in the country, Golden Ridge, which is just 20 clicks or so outside Honiara, which was years ago owned by an Australian company, became shuttered for various reasons, too complex to enunciate right now, was then bought by a Chinese state-controlled company a couple of years ago. And as part of that deal, the government, the Chinese company, loaned the government of the Solomon Islands over $1 billion to then pay for infrastructure, rail and other developments to service the mine that the Chinese company had bought. Now, that more than doubled the debt burden on the central government of the Solomon Islands. The burden of debt as a percentage of GDP went from about 10% to over 20%, something like 23%. So it's a massive increase in the debt burden on the country. And at the same time, that's to pay for infrastructure to service the Chinese-owned asset. And it was around within just a few days of that deal that the central government in the Solomon Islands switched recognition away from Taiwan and to Beijing. You put all that together with the fact that the Premier of Malaita Island has said that he and other politicians in the Solomons were offered bribes by Chinese government officials to switch recognition to Beijing. Large bribes by Solomon standards of about 160,000 Australian dollars equivalent in 2019. And that creates a pretty potent cocktail of public suspicion and resentment. And when that mine is up and running again, as it's supposed to be in a couple of years, it's projected to be by far the biggest source of industry and income on the entire island. And the question remains for the Solomons people, are we going to get a share of the benefit of this gold that's going to be flowing out of this large Golden Ridge mine?
But these are incredibly domestic issues. So is Australia intervening then, as the Premier of Malaita has said, in domestic matters by sending ADF troops and personnel and police to Honiara to try and quell these protests?
Well, inherently, of course, yes, Bev, by its nature, one country sending armed troops to another is an intervention. However, it was at the formal invitation of the government, the Prime Minister, Sogavare's invitation to Australia, a request to Australia to provide law and order under a mutual security pact that the countries already have. And it was also supported by the leader of the opposition at the time. So it was a bipartisan request to Australia to lead a regional mission, and Fiji has now joined. PNG is, I think, going to be joining as well. So it'll be a regional peace mission, just as Ramsey was all those years ago. So it's an intervention, but if it's at the request of the legitimate and elected government of the country and with support of the opposition under an agreed treaty, it's pretty hard to argue that it's in any way a partisan or forced intervention.
Yeah. Sogavare, though, has been quite disingenuous by implying Australia had a role in stoking the unrest because of issues with China, but while still asking us for help, though.
Yes, it's a bit conflicted, isn't it? Australia, please lead a peacekeeping mission into our country to restore law and order. And we know you've been fomenting the disturbance at the same time. It doesn't ring true because it's not true. The Australian government was not doing anything, or Australian agents, to foment unrest. The Solomon Islands government was doing that pretty effectively by itself. Now, Sogavare wasn't quite that crass. He didn't actually name Australia, but he said that the countries that opposed the Solomon switch in recognition away from Taiwan to Beijing were the ones creating trouble. And that means, that's wink, wink, nod, nod, that means the US and Australia and Taiwan. It's nonsense. However, it does gel with, it fits neatly with the story that's being told by the Chinese government's propaganda mouthpieces, the Global Times notably, that the Australians, according to the Global Times, were fomenting this unrest in the Solomons, just as Prime Minister Sogavare has hinted. So that's all part of a delegitimisation of the Australian government and the Australian role in all of this, which is pretty disingenuous, as you say, when he's the guy who's been inviting the Australian government to provide the peacekeeping mission. From the Australian point of view, however, the Australian government would rather be the country providing the stabilisation force than allowing or leaving Sogavare to turn to, for example, Beijing for a military peacekeeping force because of the Chinese, or I should say the Australian, fear that a Chinese force might be extremely slow and reluctant to disperse from that job.
Peter, thank you as always for your time.
Pleasure, Bev.